Assalamu alaikum. I'm Carl Arrindell and you're watching In Focus. Now, according to Human Rights Watch's Asia Division Director Brad Adams, in recent weeks, hundreds of Rohingya homes have been burned to the ground in the Rakhine district of Myanmar as part of a massive government security crackdown following the alleged killing of 9 police officers in Maungdaw village bordering the Bangladesh borders last month. High-definition satellite images show 820 newly identified structures destroyed in 5 different Rohingya Muslim villages in the troubled Rakhine state this month, where the military is carrying out counter-insurgency operations. Human rights groups, aid workers, news reporters are being denied access to the area as calls have been made for Myanmar to allow the United Nations to assist in an impartial investigations. Scores of Rohingya Muslims have attempted to flee to Bangladesh as a result of the crackdown, with reports of the Rohingya being shot as they tried to cross the river Naaf that separates Myanmar and Bangladesh, while others arriving by boat have been pushed away by Bangladeshi border guards. A total of 130 people have been killed in the latest surge of violence in the country, according to the army, that is. It has been suggested that this latest surge of violence underscores the lack of oversight by the military by the now 7-month-old Aung San Suu Kyi administration. And with me to discuss the current and ongoing crisis against the Rohingya Muslims is Dr. Tom MacManus, co-author of last year's groundbreaking report, Countdown to Annihilation, Genocide in Myanmar. Dr. Tom MacManus is based at the Queen's Mary University of London School of Law and is one of the board members of the International State Crime Initiative, across disciplinary research centre working to further understanding of state crime, organisational deviance and the violation of human rights. He's the Associate Editor of State Crime Journal. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. MacManus, and welcome to In Focus. Now, how is it that what effectively amounts to ethnic cleansing of a people who have long roots in Burma, or Myanmar as it's now called, is being allowed to take place when the branding of the Rohingya by the majority Buddhist population has led to them facing intense discrimination, repression and violence, and what's been described by some as an apartheid-like restrictions on movement, as well as a denial of their citizenship?
Well, the persecution of the Rohingya that we're seeing now was an entirely predictable result of the process that we documented when we were in Rakhine State 18 months ago or longer ago. And what we understand is that there is a process going on. It's a process that we call a genocidal process, and we do that because we have compared it to recognised genocides in the past. And the process follows a very particular set of stages, which I can bring you through the stages. The first stage is you find a group that is othered. We get an us and them dynamic set up. And this othered group is stigmatized. So the Burmese government would say that the Rohingya are illegal Bengalis. They will say that there is a threat of Islam terror, a method we're very used to here in the UK as well, to stigmatize groups of people. And after you have stigmatization, you fall into the next stage, which is harassment, which is when this psychological harassment becomes physical. And we have the burning down of villages and state terror. We've talked to people in Rakhine State that village leaders who said Rakhine Buddhist village leaders who said they received letters from the authorities saying to have men ready to be bussed down into Sittwe town, to burn down Muslim households and to drive them into camps.
So, sorry to interject. Are you saying that these letters are state-led? They are coming from central government?
We can't say where the letters came from. What we can say is the letters had enough authority that the official state authority people running the villages took them seriously enough to follow them, and everyone was afraid not to follow these letters. But we haven't seen these letters, we don't know where they came from. But we do know that the authorities, the local authorities, did follow. And the point about the harassment, one of the points is to check if anyone's prosecuted. If they are prosecuted, then people will understand that this is not state policy. But they weren't prosecuted. And what ended up happening around Sittwe is the Rohingya, about 120,000 were rounded up into camps, which can only be called detention camps. You're not allowed leave. And this is the stage of isolation. After the stage of isolation, we reach systematic weakening. And that's what we documented in Rakhine State. There are 140,000 Rohingya in detention camps. They're not allowed to go to school. Food is restricted and sometimes withdrawn. You're not allowed to organise politically. You're not allowed to have a job to have a livelihood. So it's an incredibly depressing scene when you go into these camps. And people have been there now since October 2012. So it's 4 years.
After the last outbreak of violence.
The previous, exactly, the upflare of violence. And that's the stage we call systematic weakening. You weaken the population that has been detained. We were only in and around Sittwe because we weren't allowed to any of the rest of Rakhine State, and we can talk about that as well, this problem of this informational black hole. But we do know from credible reports and satellite imagery what's going on up there, and we do know that people are restricted to their villages. So again, they've been isolated. And our concern when we released our report this time last year is that the next stage is annihilation. And if nothing is done, we say that it's not guaranteed that we'll move into the annihilation stage, but this ground is set now. And if nothing is done soon, then we think that'll start. And then we come to 2 months ago, when this violence we see more violence, and on a larger scale now, with the army involved for the first time. There's a real concern that we are now tipping over into the next stage. And we can really say now that we've entered the next phase of this process.
Now, your report, which I think you sort of promoted as being based on an unprecedented systematic field research in Myanmar, was said to provide compelling evidence of a coordinated state-led plan of genocide against the Rohingya. Firstly, how, given all these restrictions you talked about, and I know we're talking these days about satellite images, and that's because nobody can get in. How, with these restrictions of access, did you manage such research? And secondly, how have your claims of the state-led plan been received by the international community?
So we went into Rakhine State. We went in not knowing really what we were going to find. We spent 3 months, 2 researchers, questioning people in Sittwe and around Sittwe and all the villages we could get to, including inside the camps. We did ask for access to everywhere else. We were completely refused. So we were able to build our data on the people we spoke to directly. And by putting together, we must have done over 150 interviews. I think the exact number is 176. And these are people in disparate geographical areas and telling the same story over and over. And we're able to triangulate between dates and reports and what the government has said. So we were able to get from the ground what was happening. And then we have to do an analysis of the government's statements that they make as well. And the government do make statements. They do explain some things that are happening. We talked to some government officials, the Attorney General we talked to in Sittwe, and he said that there was no prosecutions for the 200 deaths.
But did he give any explanation why there weren't?
He did. He said that the reason we couldn't prosecute is that most of the burning down of the villages and the murders happened at night. And he said that in that case, you can't collect evidence, which is just
so it was a blanket
unbelievable
acceptance that they weren't going to try to collect anything.
Absolutely. No cases ongoing, no one being sought for any of the killings, and it was a huge level of impunity. And this gives a green light to nationalists and people who carried out these acts. They are then encouraged and emboldened to continue on with that line of thinking. We also know that the government deselected every single Muslim politician in the country. And that shows you the kind of trend.
That was in the recent elections which we celebrated Burma or Myanmar being on the road to democracy with the election of Aung San Suu Kyi.
Exactly. And the question is, what kind of democracy are we on the way to? What is this going to look like? We also know that the press is heavily monitored in Myanmar. So anything that comes out of the national press, you can say that has been through a government filter, and in a way is the government's ideology, for want of a better word. And we know that a journalist was recently fired from the Myanmar Times for reporting on the Rakhine state situation. And that again reinforces the government's involvement and denial of the situation.
And underlines your language of state-led. Now, why is classification of genocide so important?
Well, the G word, as you will hear it called in political circles, is a very emotive, politically entrenched word. And people don't like to use it because it implies, under the treaties, it implies that governments have obligations to do something about it to prevent it. So you will find governments avoiding using the term in the first place. And you don't want to use the term if you don't see what you're seeing is not a genocide. You don't want to be emotive or exaggerate the situation. But the clear fact is we went there, we documented it, analysed it, compared to genocides of the past, and it just was shockingly clear what's going on there is in fact a genocidal process. Has a genocide taken place? Probably not. But if something is not done, the status quo is just not going to hold the situation contained as it is at the moment. If nothing is done, we may well be leading past towards the next stage of this.
The gas chamber stage.
Well, this is the reaching a solution.
Now, Human Rights Watch have said that new satellite imagery, and as we mentioned just now, it seems to be the only way to get information at the moment, recorded on November the 10th, 17th and 18th, that's this month, brings the number of destroyed buildings documented to 1,250. Rohingya activists have claimed that hundreds of arrests have been made, with at least 1,000 houses in Maungdaw burned down and more than 100 people killed. Tens of thousands of Rohingyas have fled their homes, and there are allegations of rape and sexual assault of women and girls. But it would seem that the true extent of this crisis is not verifiable, and there have been government denials as a result of the restrictions of access. Nobody's able to justify or relate those. Aid workers and journalists can't get in. Are you surprised that there has not been more of an international outcry? We're not seeing this story of genocide being headlined in our newspapers. And why do you think the West is so reluctant to respond to these flagrant breaches of human rights being perpetrated, especially given that the Premier is the Nobel Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi?
Well, I am surprised. I must say I have been surprised since I started looking into this matter since late 2012. I am surprised there's not more about it on the news based on what we do know for a fact and also what we have been able to speculate from other bits and pieces of information coming out. One of the reasons maybe we don't see it on the news more is you cannot get a news crew in there. So it's very difficult for a 24-hour news channel to do a story without footage, and I think that's just maybe a limitation of the news. So without being able to send people in there, you have to take your information from people on the ground. And it's a question of how do you know these sources, where did they come from? Sources are very scared to talk because we have had situations where people have got into camps in Rakhine State, journalists, and then the people they have talked to, all of them, have been rounded up as soon as the journalists leave. So journalists are even afraid to go in because they're going to be causing problems for the people they talk to. So we haven't seen it in the press that way. But governments know about it. They've been told. We've written to the UK government twice. The first time they said to us, you can't say it's a genocide, only a court of law can do that. In other words, wait till after there are thousands of deaths and then we will look into the situation. And then there's the question of the US's power when it comes to this issue. The US and Obama was scrambling to find a legacy foreign policy success story. Something that he could point to after he leaves office and say, well, you know, I had some failures in foreign policy, but Burma, Myanmar came out and is now progressing towards democracy. These stories, as well as the other ethnic civil wars that are going on, like raging in the country at the moment, paint a bad picture in the foreign policy success story for Hillary Clinton and the American administration. So they're very reluctant as well to come along and say, actually, it's not as good as we were saying it was. And then there's Aung San Suu Kyi, as you mentioned. I think she had built up a lot of goodwill over the years. A lot of people were willing to give her a chance. We talked about seeing what she does in the first 100 days. We're now coming up to 300 days, and she is incredibly, shockingly silent on this issue.
So what is it? I mean, is this an expose on her real character? Is she just being purely pragmatic? Does she, are the Rohingyas the collateral damage that has to be allowed to take place in order to push Myanmar towards democratic values? Or is it that the military still have such power and control?
The short answer is we don't know. We can't know. We haven't heard anything from Aung San Suu Kyi on this. But I think you're right. I think it's all of those things. I think it's incredibly politically damaging to be said to be supporting Muslims in the face of Buddhism, which is considered under threat. And there are extremist monks that are really running